On April 23, 1985, the Coca-Cola company did something unthinkable. They announced they were killing the original Coke formula, not expanding the lineup, not offering a choice, eliminating the drink that had existed for 99 years and replacing it with something sweeter, smoother, and according to 200,000 taste tests, better. Within 24 hours, their hotline was flooded with thousands of furious calls. Within weeks, protest groups formed across America. Within 79 days, Coca-Cola capitulated, bringing back the original formula in what became one of the most humiliating corporate retreats in history. The disaster cost over $100 million and nearly destroyed the world's most recognized brand. This is the story of how listening to your customers can make them hate you. By 1984, Coca-Cola wasn't just a beverage company. It was a piece of the American identity. Founded in 1886 in an Atlanta pharmacy, Coke had spent nearly a century weaving itself into the fabric of daily life. It was the pause that refreshes. It was Santa Claus in red and white. It was what soldiers drank overseas and what families shared at dinner tables. The numbers reflected this dominance. Coca-Cola commanded roughly 60% of the US cola market. The company operated in more than 160 countries. Annual revenues exceeded $10 billion. The brand was recognized by more people globally than virtually any other logo on Earth. Coke's distribution network was unmatched. Its profit margins were strong. Its market position seemed untouchable. But the company's real competitive advantage wasn't the formula. It was emotional ownership. Consumers didn't just prefer Coke, they identified with it. The drink represented nostalgia, tradition, and shared memory. It was a cultural artifact that happened to be sold in bottles. This created a dangerous assumption inside the company. Leadership began to believe that Coke was chosen rationally, not emotionally. That the product could be optimized like any other consumer good. By 1985, that assumption would be tested in the most public way possible. The empire was not collapsing, but the trend lines were concerning. Throughout the late 1970s and the early 1980s, PepsiCo launched an aggressive campaign called the Pepsi Challenge. The concept was simple: blind taste tests in shopping malls and stores across America. Participants would sample 2 unmarked colas and choose their favorite. Consistently, the majority chose Pepsi. The sweeter formula performed better in direct comparisons, and the campaign worked. Pepsi's United States market share climbed from around 6% in the 1950s to nearly 30% by the early 1980s. Coke's lead was narrowing. The company that once dominated was now defending territory. Inside Coca-Cola, the alarm bells were ringing. The company commissioned its own research, conducting blind taste tests involving nearly 200,000 participants. The results confirmed what Pepsi had been broadcasting. In direct comparisons, consumers preferred sweeter colas. This included both Pepsi and a reformulated Coke prototype that the company had been quietly developing. The data pointed to a troubling pattern. Younger consumers, especially those under 25, were gravitating toward Pepsi. If this trend continued, Coke risked losing an entire generation of drinkers. Market share projections suggested that, without intervention, Pepsi could overtake Coca-Cola within a decade. The problem was not that Coke was failing. Sales remained strong, profits were healthy. But leadership saw the trajectory and believed that defending the status quo meant accepting eventual defeat. The question became, do we wait for the decline to become irreversible? Or do we act while we still have market dominance? By late 1984, Coca-Cola's executives had made their decision. They would not simply respond to Pepsi. They would eliminate the threat entirely by beating Pepsi at its own game. In April 1985, Coca-Cola announced the most radical product decision in the company's history. They would discontinue the original Coke formula, the recipe that had existed since 1886, and replace it with new Coke, a sweeter, smoother reformulation designed specifically to win taste tests. This was not a line extension. It was not a variant for a new demographic. It was a complete replacement. the original Coke would cease to exist. Leadership believed the data was overwhelming. In controlled tests, new Coke had outperformed both the original formula and Pepsi. If consumers preferred the taste in blind comparisons, executives reasoned, they would buy it in the real world. The decision had been years in the making. The company had spent over $4 million on research and development. They had conducted taste tests with nearly 200,000 people across multiple cities. The feedback was clear. New Coke was preferred by 55% of participants compared to original Coke, and it performed even better against Pepsi. The company believed the evidence was definitive. Alternatives had been considered and rejected. Some executives suggested launching New Coke alongside the original formula, letting consumers choose. Others proposed positioning original Coke as a heritage product while marketing New Coke to younger demographics. These ideas were dismissed as indecisive. Leadership feared that offering two colas would confuse the market, dilute the brand, and signal weakness. Confidence, they believed, required commitment. The rollout was massive. Production lines were retooled. Distribution networks were updated. A $10 million advertising campaign was prepared to introduce New Coke to the American public. The launch event was held at New York's Lincoln Center, with executives framing the change as bold innovation. Chief Executive Officer Roberto Goizueta declared it the surest move the company had ever made. What they failed to account for was that Coca-Cola was no longer just a product. It had become something larger than the company itself. And they were about to learn that some things do not belong to the corporation that makes them. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours of the announcement, Coca-Cola's headquarters began receiving complaint calls at a rate never seen before. By the end of the first week, the company was fielding up to 8,000 calls per day, nearly all of them negative. The company had to hire additional staff and set up a dedicated hotline just to handle the volume. The anger was not about taste, it was about betrayal. Consumers described feeling like a piece of their childhood had been stolen. Letters arrived by the thousands. Some were heartfelt, expressing genuine grief. Others were furious, accusing the company of arrogance. One letter said, "There are only two things in my life, God and Coca-Cola. Now you've taken one of those away from me." Protest groups formed. The most prominent was called Old Cola Drinkers of America, which threatened to file a class action lawsuit to force Coca-Cola to bring back the original formula. Some consumers began hoarding original Coke, buying cases and storing them like survival supplies. Reports emerged of people driving across state lines to find remaining inventory of old Coke. On the black market, bottles of original formula were selling for $30 each. Sales data confirmed the backlash. While New Coke performed adequately in some test markets, overall sales began to decline. Pepsi immediately seized the opportunity, declaring victory with ads proclaiming, "The other guy blinked." In some regional markets, Pepsi overtook Coca-Cola in sales for the first time in decades. Coca-Cola's market share began eroding rapidly. By June 1985, Pepsi had closed the gap to single digits in several major cities. Media coverage turned brutal. Newsweek called it a marketing fiasco. The New York Times described the decision as corporate hubris. Late-night comedians made New Coke the punchline of the summer. Coca-Cola's brand equity, built over 99 years, was evaporating in real time. Internal estimates suggested the company was losing $4 million per day in sales and brand value. After just 79 days, on July 11, 1985, Coca-Cola surrendered. At a press conference, company president Donald Keough announced that the original formula would return as Coca-Cola Classic. He framed it as a response to consumer passion, saying, "We have heard you," but the tone was unmistakable. This was a surrender. The financial damage was staggering. Coca-Cola wrote off $100 million in research, development, production retooling, and marketing costs. The company's stock had dropped. Market share had been lost to Pepsi, and the brand's reputation for understanding its customers had been permanently scarred. So what went wrong? How did the world's most successful beverage company misread its own customers so catastrophically? The failure came down to three fundamental mistakes, each rooted in the same error: treating an emotional brand like a rational product. First, Coca-Cola confused preference with loyalty. The blind taste tests measured sensory response, not emotional attachment. In a controlled environment, consumers might choose a sweeter cola. But in the real world, they were not buying a flavor profile. They were buying a memory. The company measured what people liked in isolation but failed to account for what people loved in context. This violated a fundamental rule: customers do not always choose what they say they prefer. Emotional bonds override rational preferences. Second, the company removed choice instead of expanding it. By eliminating the original formula, Coca-Cola forced a binary decision: accept new Coke or abandon the brand entirely. Loyal customers felt cornered. What they should have done was introduce new Coke as an option, not a replacement. Pepsi did not succeed by replacing its formula. It succeeded by offering an alternative. The correct strategy was already proven by the market, but Coca-Cola ignored it. This violated another principle: never corner loyal customers. When people feel they have no choice, they rebel. Third, Coca-Cola treated a cultural icon like a product stock-keeping unit. Leadership approached the formula change as a simple product optimization. But Coca-Cola had transcended its corporate ownership. It belonged to the public imagination. It was part of American culture. The company had the legal right to change the formula, but they did not have the emotional authority. What they should have done was recognize that some brands exist beyond the balance sheet, and any change requires treating the public as stakeholders, not just consumers. This violated the deepest principle: emotional brands require emotional strategy. The irony is that Coca-Cola's research was not wrong. New Coke did taste better in blind tests. The data was accurate, but the conclusion was false, because people do not drink brands blind. They drink them with context, history, and meaning attached. And when you strip away that meaning, the product becomes worthless, no matter how good it tastes. Today, Coca-Cola Classic remains one of the world's most valuable brands. New Coke was quietly discontinued in 2002. The lesson endures. Data can tell you what people like, but not what they love. And when a company forgets who really owns the brand, the market will remind them.